All right, today we're tackling religious reformation, but from a really unique angle. The source we're looking at argues that reform isn't just some historical event you read about in a textbook. Instead, it's like a progressive light, one that's still unfolding, even today. So that leads to this pretty wild question, right? What if the Protestant Reformation never actually ended? What if it's less of a single event and more like a relay race of truth, where the baton gets passed from one generation to the next? So the source we're digging into today presents this as a progressive story. Think of it like a climb towards a better understanding of truth. Each generation is supposed to take the light from the one before it and climb even higher. And our story really kicks off with the very first, absolutely crucial step, making that truth accessible to everyone. So this whole idea of a progressive light, it all starts with a foundational struggle. I'm talking about the fight to make the Bible accessible to ordinary people. And right at the heart of that fight, you've got the incredible, relentless conviction of one man, William Tyndale. I mean, just think about the sheer audacity of that statement. It's kind of breathtaking, right? Tyndale wasn't just talking to some random person on the street. He was saying this right to the face of a highly educated Catholic doctor. This one quote just perfectly sums up his entire mission: to break the clergy's monopoly on Scripture and put the Bible directly into the hands of an ordinary plowboy. And let me tell you, his quest was anything but easy. He was hunted, harassed all across Europe. He had to flee England for his life. He tries to print in Germany, but he gets shut down not once but twice. Still, he just kept going. He finally found refuge and success in Worms. And yeah, that's the same city where Martin Luther had made his own famous stand. And this next part is just a brilliant, ironic twist in the story. So you have the Bishop of Durham, who is desperately trying to shut Tyndale down. His big idea? He'll buy up Tyndale's entire stock of Bibles just so he can burn them. But, and you gotta love this, that big pile of cash was exactly what Tyndale needed to fund a brand new, even better edition. The very thing meant to snuff out the flame ended up giving it way more fuel. Now, Tyndale's story, which tragically ended with him being executed as a martyr, really introduces a central theme in the source material we're looking at, and that is the incredibly high price these reformers paid for their convictions. Wow. This quote from Bishop Latimer is just searing, isn't it? He's basically saying that while the official church leaders were sitting around doing nothing, a much more sinister force was out there working overtime. It paints this picture of a spiritual decay so deep that it practically demanded a radical, and yeah, a very dangerous response. So you have to ask, right? What on earth would drive these men to face that kind of danger? Well, it all came down to a set of core principles. For them, the Bible stood above any human authority. It didn't matter if you were a pope or a king. Every single doctrine, every belief had to be tested against Scripture. That was their non-negotiable foundation. And that faith, it held firm, right to the bitter end. Can you imagine? As the flames are literally being lit around him, Latimer says this to the man being burned alongside him. It's just this moment of incredible, unbelievable hope in the face of absolute horror. A deep belief that their sacrifice was going to have a lasting and eternal impact. And you know what? That candle Latimer talked about, it wasn't put out. Decades later, the persecution was still going strong. A man named John Bunyan was thrown into this awful, disgusting jail. But it was right there, surrounded by all that darkness, that he wrote one of the most influential books ever in the English language, The Pilgrim's Progress. His suffering literally became a beacon for millions. Okay, so fast forward about a century. According to the source we're examining, that candle Latimer lit was starting to flicker. It was getting dim. It was time for a new wave of reformers to step up and rekindle that flame. And this is where we meet figures like George Whitefield and, of course, John and Charles Wesley. And the situation they were walking into was pretty dire. England had really fallen into a state of spiritual darkness. If you were pious, you were mocked by the upper classes, and the lower classes, they were largely ignorant and trapped in vice. The solution presented by these revivalists was just as intense, tireless, often confrontational preaching. And, as you might guess, they were about to face their own wave of intense opposition. Yeah, and we're not just talking about a few hecklers in the crowd. This was organized violence. Mobs were actively stirred up to go and destroy their homes. There were public notices posted literally calling for people to attack the early Methodists. And yet, the movement just kept growing. It was as if it was being fueled by the very persecution that was meant to crush it. So when critics came at John Wesley, accusing him of being too strict or making the path to heaven too narrow, this was his answer. And it just perfectly captures their whole mindset, doesn't it? They absolutely refused to water down scripture just to make people feel comfortable. Theirs was a completely uncompromising message. Okay, so all of this, Tyndale, Latimer, the Wesleys, it brings us to the real heart of our source's argument. The claim is that all of these reformers were just individual players in a much larger progressive movement, a reformation that was, and according to this view, still is, unfinished. So what exactly does it mean by progressive reform? Well, the idea is that truth isn't just dropped down from heaven all at once in a complete package. Instead, God reveals light to each generation, and their job isn't just to hang on to the old truths, but to actually advance into the new truths that are being revealed. It's a dynamic faith, not a static one. And to show this idea in action, the source zeroes in on one specific and pretty controversial doctrine. So the Sabbath becomes the key example here. The source points out that, look, Martin Luther broke from Rome on a ton of issues, but he still kept observing Sunday. But then you have other reformers, guys like Karlstadt and John Frith, who looked at the scriptures and said, wait a minute, it seems to be pointing to the seventh-day Sabbath, which is Saturday. From the source's perspective, this is a perfect example of how some reformers saw a bit of light that even a giant like Luther might have missed. And the cost of following this new light? It was absolutely brutal. The source tells the story of a man named John Trask. And what was his crime? All he did was defend the seventh-day Sabbath back in the 17th century. For that, he was publicly whipped and thrown in prison. And his wife, who was a well-respected schoolteacher, she was about to face a similar fate. Nearly 16 years. Just let that sink in for a second. 16 years. Mrs. Trask was locked away in prison for almost 2 decades. And her crime wasn't theft, it wasn't murder, it was teaching school 5 days a week and choosing to rest on Saturday. She flat out refused to back down from her conviction, and she ended up dying in that prison. So all of these stories bring us to the source's big conclusion and its call to action. The whole point is that these accounts of reformers aren't just history lessons. They're presented as a kind of blueprint for how to live today. The core argument is this: if you really want to honor the reformers, you don't just stop where they stopped. To sort of freeze-frame Christianity in the time of Luther, or even in the time of the Wesleys, would be to completely miss the point. It would betray the very principle of progress that they fought and died for. So the final message here is really a direct challenge. It says it's not enough to just look back and admire what people did in the past. The real call to action is to take the light we have today and keep moving forward with it, to do exactly what the reformers themselves would have done if they were alive in our time. And so our look at this source leaves us with a pretty provocative question, one that comes straight from its pages. If the Reformation really is an unfinished project, and if the call is always to keep moving forward into new light, then what in the world might that mean for us, for our faith and our beliefs today?